tough when you're in PC. Life's rough when you depend on me to give you weapons and information for your journey, and still you still push in and try to hurt me. Life's tough when you're in PC. Life's rough.
Alright, well, it is good to be back, sitting on the couch, and unlike that previous vlog, actually doing what I really like doing on the show, which is reviewing the RPGs that are out on the market today. The place may have changed just a little bit, as you can see, but all things considered, nothing has really changed on the show. We are still looking at all of the games out there, and deciding on whether or not they have a crit, or if they have a miss. So, with that being said, I was starting to think, what's a good way to start things back up again? What's a good game to really kind of bring the people back in after my long hiatus of moving and so forth? Well, I started to really sit back and think about it, and I decided I think it's good to go back to the really interesting stuff, the stuff that just brings people in, the stuff that, you know, all kinds of RPG fans love, and that is World of Darkness. In particular this time, what we're going to be looking at today is Mage the Ascension from the classic World of Darkness line. So, your mileage and friend group and circles and whatnot may vary when it comes to this, but from the people that I have spent time around who are also really big into World of Darkness, and those who I've talked to at conventions, online, and so forth, the general consensus on Mage the Ascension is that it's a very polarizing game. And once again, it can be completely different depending upon who your friends are, who you hang out with, and so forth. But anytime that I've really talked to people that are also fans of World of Darkness, I find very few people are blasé on the matter. They have very strong opinions about Mage the Ascension, and it usually is in very, well, polarizing opposite ends. Some see it as one of the best games in the World of Darkness line, both new and old, and with some even champion it as the best game out of the entire line. Others that I've talked to absolutely detest the game, can't stand it, find it too problematic, and usually will not play it no matter who the friends are, and no matter how much others want to play it, who are also in their group. So, it's really interesting. You know, maybe it's just me, maybe this is just the people that I've personally ran into. However, if from my experience is the same as your experience and others' experiences, I find it to be a very fascinating phenomenon in the World of Darkness world. So what is Mage? It isn't an easy answer in truth, but the best that I can give you is this. Reality is not something that is fixed or stagnant. It is always moving, and it can be manipulated by those who are aware that the reality is not a static thing. I think a good person that's going to help me explain this to you is Morpheus from the Matrix.
It has the same basic rules like gravity. What you must learn is that these rules are no different than the rules of a computer system. Some of them can be bent. Others can be broken.
I am 100% convinced that the Wachowskis were huge World of Darkness fans, specifically Mage fans, because a lot of the similarities in the Matrix and how it kind of looks at things is a little too, well, what's the words I'm looking for here? It makes a little too much sense that they're both interconnected for it to just be coincidence. But regardless, that clip might not have been the 100% best way to describe it, but I really do think it gets at the heart of what Mage is, in that the world itself, in this world that we even have, is governed by rules. Rules such as physics, chemistry, and so forth. Now, similar to the Matrix in this computer world, these rules in Mage for that world are bendable. In some cases, they're even breakable. And as such, it gives mages who are attuned to this idea ways to manipulate and change the world around them to better suit their interests. Regardless of where you stand and whether or not you love it or hate it, or maybe you're one of the people I've never met who's ambivalent to it, it's really a fascinating concept regardless, and I think it's something that's really worth dissecting. This is one of the games that you really want to look at and just kind of analyze and try to understand it a little bit more. Typically speaking, this polarization that I've been talking about is due to one major factor. Sometimes people dislike the mythos itself or the central concept of the game, but most of the time it tends to come down to the gameplay and how the game is ran/structured. We'll touch a little bit more on that in the future, but right now I really want to focus on the idea, the mythos of Mage. And when it comes to the mythos of Mage, let's go ahead and describe it. It's a little bit of goddamn everything. No joke, World of Darkness is big on tapping into cultural stories and really keeps a pulse on the zeitgeist of humanity. It definitely focuses more on the horror elements, obviously, by focusing on vampires, werewolves, and so forth. However, they really do try to branch out and really touch upon just about any sort of like nerdy genre that you can think of. World of Darkness, even from the 90s, even to the 2000s and today, is always really good on tapping into these cultural stories and really finding a way to blend them seamlessly into their own creation. Now, usually this tends to stick with, like, you know, in a given game. Like Vampire, you get vampire mythos throughout the years, which really stretches far and wide, and it gets adapted as time goes on and new stuff comes available. The same can be said for, well, let's say, Werewolf. Mage, however, is very weird because it's kind of a jack-of-all-trades type. It really is a mix of everything that they didn't really use. There's cyberpunk, there's these like mafia, there's these classical Merlin type mages, there's these really weird fuckers that kind of splice animals together, there are these people that turn into cyborgs or use like cybernetics, steampunk is in here, cyberpunk is in here, and let's say there's even like, what else, like a couple of hippies as well, and it taps in even to Cthulhu mythos. It's very broad in what it sort of covers, especially for Mage. It is also strangely a very strong point of the game instead of a weakness. I do have a lot of love for Mage, for being able to thread a very fine needle just so you have the idea of these mages and making sure that you incorporate all types of mages into existence. You have traditional mages, you have hippies, you have the mafia, Catholic mages, feminists, goth kids, a cyborg, some strange splicey creature looking thing. You have various other mages from various different cultures, such as Maori, as well as Chinese and Japanese folklore. And I haven't even scratched the surface here. Like, this mythos is more conceptually diverse than Star Trek at this point, whenever you really factor things in. So it's really interesting because whenever you have like games like this that have all these different ideas, like steampunk, like cyberpunk, mixing all of these together, it sometimes feels very, very convoluted. Like you kind of should have maybe focused on a better, you know, putting one idea and making it really, really good instead of 50 ideas and they're all okay. But somehow, Mage really makes it all work. It actually takes all of these ideas and blends them rather seamlessly together. The game, like others in the series, separates itself into factions. In Vampire it is sex, in Mage it is paradigms, and these are general beliefs held by each of the factions. Unlike other games that are usually maybe 1 or 2, Mage has 5. The Traditions, which is a fellowship of mages with their own points of view in saying the matter. The Technocratic Union, or Technocracy, which was first all about control and is now much more about bringing science and truth to humanity. Disasperates, which are just independent mages doing their own thing. Marauders, who have lost their sense of reality studying how to be a mage. And Nefandi, which are mages who are out to either destroy or corrupt the world. And the one thing I also really love is that there are a lot of options when it comes to Mage. You see, I mean, Vampire, you have the 13 original clans, and then you have just a cornucopia of bloodlines. With Mage, you have 31 different types of mages to choose from, and they can be very customizable, which is also a major benefit. And they stretch so many different cultures and ideas. They really try to cover everything when it comes to magic and how it's used. The culture, well, it can sometimes get a little uncomfortable, especially depending on how old the game is, but for the most part, it's a pretty solid plus. You have 31 different mages that you can choose from, and this sort of customizable nature, as well as just the plethora of options, is fantastic. I will always take complication over parsimony as long as it's done seamlessly any day in a game. How mages use their power is typically where we run into some of this polarization. But for the time being, just allow me to kind of explain things generally. Mages have the ability to manipulate spheres of influence that exist in this world and attach to concepts of how the world works. These include the sphere of life, death, time, the spirit, matter, mind, correspondence, entropy, and prime. And also these can vary a little bit as well. It really kind of depends on if you are a traditionalist or if you're in the technocracy. Because if you're in the technocracy, you have some other options such as data and sort of virtual kind of realities that you can tap into as well. And here's where things sort of jump off the rails. Well, less jump off the rails and more like the train sprouts wings and flies away. These spheres work similar to other mechanics in World of Darkness, where you have dots from 1 to 5. Unlike other games, mages have the ability to operate in all of these spheres with the appropriate amount of time and attention, with their chosen organization having one particular one that tends to be their bread and butter. And there's very little barriers that kind of stop them from venturing out too far. While the game does have verbiage for the use of these powers, the wording is a little, well, let's just say that it's a little bit open-ended. And whenever I say open-ended, I mean you can pretty much do whatever the fuck you feel like doing as long as you can justify it. It is rather intentional. The game clearly is trying to allow players to be mages and not be constrained by the game itself. At the same time, things can get a little wild when you're left unchecked from the players and even from the storyteller. And I mean, I'm just talking about like the baseline use of like correspondence, the baseline use of prime, or the baseline use of element. Now, whenever we actually get into blending spheres, that's when things really get a little bit wild. There's entire websites out there of ways in which you can blend your various abilities and spheres together into these just crazy magical ideas that are extremely overpowered, even for like low level, like 2 dots in correspondence, 1 dot in life sort of deal. It's really creative and wild at the same time. It's like a game. It's like a video game where modders have just been able to run wild with whatever they want to do without any checks. One of the first times I played, I was playing an Aetherite, which is essentially a steampunk mage, because, I mean, why not? And within the first session and the dots I had, I was able to create an automaton, a big automaton. The concept alone blew my mind, because this was something I thought would take a lot of time and effort as a mage, but this is something that I was able to do within the first session, let alone what I was actually even imagining in my head to be like 5-10 sessions down the line. It really took me aback the first time I played it several years ago of just how wild mage can be. And this is where we really run into our big problem when it comes to mage, is that the players are very loosely regulated. The storyteller is even less loosely regulated. So if you have a game in which the storyteller doesn't know when to say no, at the same time while also being consistent with how they say no, and if you have the players that are ready to run off the rails, the game gets out of hand extremely quickly, far more quickly than other games out there. And also, let's be honest, the level of freedom, it can be intimidating for some players who do like the structure that something like, let's say, D&D has, where you know the spells that you are casting instead of trying to argue if you actually have the ability to cast Fireball or not. Not to mention, if the game does come down to arguing with the storyteller whether or not you have the ability to do something, then the game becomes much more skewed to players who are much more garrulous and outgoing, while players who are much more introverted and quiet have a really bad time. Is this a problem? Yes! Yes, regardless of whatever the final score is of this game, this is a bit of a problem with the game. The fact of the matter is, you still need an exceptionally good storyteller to run a mage game who understands the intricacies of the game and knows how to say no, when to say no, how to keep it consistent, and also how to just keep the players in check for running off the rails. And also being aware of which players are going to run off the rails. And I know a lot of you are going to say, well, everybody needs to be experienced to be a storyteller or something like that. No, like a lot of like D&D, Vampire the Masquerade, you can tend to get by with baseline knowledge and kind of work as you go. With Mage, similar to Wraith, if you are not exceptionally experienced in this setting, playing it several times to understand it, and then reading the book, rereading, I suggest at least 3 reads of the M20 massive book of Mage before you actually run a game. And I mean it. 3 pages of no skimming. 3 read-throughs of this giant book with no skimming to make sure you understand everything. Because if not, there's going to be someone who is going to run roughshod, and the game is going to run off the rails very, very quickly. And this might not even be the player's fault. The player might just be playing and coming up with really smart decisions, and then suddenly, before you know it, you have a demigod on your hands, and there's no real way to stop them because there were no no's that came into play by the time that he got the 3rd dot, let alone the 5th dot. So it's something to really keep in mind, and it is something that does sort of put an asterisk on the game. Rules are the boundaries that keep games in check, or else we're just a bunch of people role-playing and making up arbitrary rules as we go along, like kids on the playground. For Mage, it is absolutely imperative that you have a storyteller who is meticulous enough to understand the ins and outs of this game to a higher degree, and also understands that you actually do have to say no sometimes, and you also still have to be consistent, because if you're not consistent, then that's really going to screw over the one player who was actually being creative, who arbitrarily got railroaded because you just said no to him but said yes to the other 3. But here's the big question. Is it enough to send this game down into the depths as one of the worst games in the World of Darkness line, to get a miss and to be ever branded, and for my video to always have at least a high number of downvotes? No, absolutely not, actually. I think that this game is actually pretty good, even with that massive problem attached to it. I like Mage. I really, really like Mage. Don't get me wrong, the game isn't perfect. The mechanics in place that are unique to Mage leave the game wide open for problems that are loosely moderated by other mechanics at best. The game isn't perfect. However, it more than makes up for the shortfalls with blending various elements together seamlessly that really shouldn't have been mixed together, and also offering what is probably the most organic opportunity to be a mage that you always wanted to be. Mage gets a crit. It actually does. It really does. It isn't perfect, but whenever you really take in the elements of the gameplay that are still problematic and you get that right storyteller and those right players together, you actually get what is one of the best opportunities you ever will to understand the mage who you thought that you could be based on your own intelligence, wits, and cunning. And I think that really offers a really great experience, and why a lot of people really like Mage. It is one of the most personal games that I can think of. It is a game that really taps in to who you are as a person, what your knowledge is, and how you can transfer that knowledge into very interesting gameplay by really coming up with some very creative ideas. As such, while the game does have some minor problems with it, okay, maybe even one is not so much minor, it's kind of major, it still gets a crit. I still love playing it, and I really do suggest that if you find the right person to run the game, you should play it because it is a lot of fun.